The summer of 2022 came down on Pottawatomie County, the way bad years always come gradually, and then all at once. By July, the wheat was in and the numbers were in, and most of the men who had farmed that ground their whole lives were sitting at kitchen tables trying to figure out which bill to pay first. The county average came in at 31 bushels per acre. At the price wheat was bringing that year, the math worked out to somewhere between $20 and $40 of margin per acre, after input costs, and for some operations on higher cost ground, it did not work out to anything at all. Sadie Boone was standing beside her truck in the field road off County Road 12 when she looked at the printout Joyce Gallagher had sent over from the extension office. 3 missed calls on her phone from neighbors, 2 of whom she knew were deciding whether to ask the bank for an operating loan advance before the winter. She had not called them back yet. Levi came up beside her and she handed him the paper without saying anything. He read it the way he read everything carefully, and without hurry, the way a man reads something he has been thinking about for months, and is only now seeing confirmed in print. Then he looked at the number at the bottom of the Boone operation column, and he looked at the county average column beside it, and he set the paper down on the hood of the truck. $316 per acre on the dual-purpose ground. He did not say anything for a long time. Sadie looked out across the field toward the back channel of the property where the cattle had grazed the previous fall and winter. The ground that 3 years ago had been the subject of a manila folder on a kitchen table, and a silence that lasted through July and August and into the first week of September. She thought about that kitchen table. She thought about the look on her father's face when she set the folder down. The particular look of a man who recognizes something he has been carrying a long time inside a proposal he has never seen before. That was June of 2019. 3 years before the summer, the drought answered every question that numbers alone had not been able to settle. The Boone family had been farming Pottawatomie County since Sadie's great-grandfather, August, broke sod on the home place in 1931, which was not a good year to start farming. But he had done it anyway, and the ground had stayed in the family through everything Kansas had thrown at it since. By the time Sadie came back from Kansas State in May of 2019 with her degree in animal science and agronomy and a folder of research she had been building since her junior year, the operation ran 1,800 acres of cropland and a cow-calf herd of about 140 head, and Levi Boone had been farming it for 32 years. He kept yield records going back 3 decades in a filing cabinet in the mudroom. He could tell you the bushels per acre on any field for any year without looking it up. He planted wheat on roughly 900 acres. Every fall ran his cattle on native pasture through the summer, bought hay and supplement through the winter when the pasture ran out. He was not getting rich. He was not going broke. He was doing what 4 generations of Boones had done on that ground, which was hold on. Sadie had grown up watching him do it. She knew this operation the way she knew the sound of the combine at night, which is to say she knew it in her bones before she knew it in her head. But 4 years at K-State had rearranged the furniture in certain rooms, and the course that did the most rearranging was a junior year seminar in range ecology taught by a professor named Dr. Donna Slater. Dr. Slater had spent 20 years studying grazing systems across the Great Plains. She was not a person who presented ideas. She presented evidence, and the distinction mattered to Sadie in the way that distinctions matter to people who have been trained to make them. The practice Dr. Slater introduced in the second week of the semester was called dual-purpose wheat production, and it was not a new idea. Farmers across the southern plains had been grazing cattle on young wheat in the fall and early winter for decades. Oklahoma State University had been studying it since the 1970s. The principle was this: winter wheat planted in September reaches a vegetative growth stage in October and November, where it can support grazing pressure without permanent damage to the stand. provided the cattle are removed before the plant reaches jointing, which is the point at which the growing point rises above the soil surface and becomes vulnerable. Remove the cattle before jointing, which in Kansas typically occurred in late February or early March, and the wheat recovers. It tillers aggressively. In most years, it produces a yield within 5 to 6% of an ungrazed stand. The cattle, meanwhile, gain weight on forage that costs the farmer almost nothing beyond the fence and the management, because the wheat is already planted, already growing, already there. The Oklahoma State data showed stocker cattle gaining 2 to 2.5 pounds per day on wheat pasture, with no supplemental feed required in most years. Sadie had run the numbers on her father's ground before she finished the semester. She had run them conservatively, using the low end of the gain data and the high end of the yield penalty. Even with every assumption tilted against the practice, the math came out the same way every time. Dual-purpose wheat made more money per acre than grain-only wheat, not a little more, substantially more. She had not brought those numbers home yet, when Dr. Slater paused one afternoon near the end of the semester and asked the class a question. She asked if anyone knew about Pottawatomie County, Kansas in 1987. Sadie did not know. None of them knew. A farmer in that county, Dr. Slater said, had grazed his winter wheat that fall and winter. He had not monitored the growing point carefully. He had not removed his cattle before jointing. The wheat had gone into its critical spring growth stage under sustained grazing pressure, and the stand had failed. By May, the field was gone. The county remembered it for years afterward, which is how things work in places where everyone knows what everyone else is doing. And one man's failure becomes the frame through which everyone else evaluates the next idea that resembles it. She said that the Oklahoma State data had documented the incident, not anonymously, by name. A farmer named Weaver in Pottawatomie County, Kansas, 1987. Cattle not removed prior to jointing. Stand loss 60 to 70%. And right beside that documentation in the same table, the notation that the researchers had placed there so that the data would not be misread. Management failure, not system failure. In a small county, Dr. Slater said, nobody makes that distinction. They remember the field. They remember the name. They do not remember the footnote. Sadie wrote 4 words in her notebook that afternoon. The difference matters. She drove back to the home place in May of 2019 with the folder on the passenger seat and the 4 words somewhere in her chest. And she spent the first 2 weeks helping with the end-of-season work and watching her father move through the operation with the efficiency of a man who has done the same things in the same order for 32 years and knows exactly where every minute goes. She waited until the second week of June to put the folder on the kitchen table. Levi looked at it the way a man looks at a piece of mail. He suspects contains bad news. He was 56 years old, and he had been up since 5, and there was machinery to service before the afternoon got too hot, and his daughter had driven home from college with a diploma and a manila folder, and was sitting across the table with the particular stillness of someone who has been rehearsing this conversation since March. She walked him through it page by page. The Oklahoma State yield trial data, the gain per day numbers across the 50-year study, her own calculations on the home place ground, using conservative estimates throughout, the revenue comparison in a year when wheat prices were soft, which was most years. He listened to all of it. He asked about joining dates, which she had mapped by field using the county extension records. He asked about temporary fencing costs, which she had priced from 3 suppliers. He asked whether the wheat really recovered the way the data said it did, and she told him that the data showed it consistently and that she had read the underlying methodology and believed it. She had anticipated every question he asked. She had been anticipating them since March. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He picked up the top page and looked at it again and set it back down. He said he needed to think about it. Nora was at the counter refilling coffee cups and not saying anything. She looked at Sadie across the kitchen and gave a small nod that Levi did not see. That nod meant two things at once. It meant you are right. It also meant give him time. That evening, Sadie was at the sink finishing the dinner dishes when Nora came and stood beside her with a dish towel, the way she sometimes did when she had something to say, and had chosen the location because it did not require either of them to look directly at the other. She said Sadie needed to know something before the conversation continued. She said the name Harold Weaver. She did not say it the way you say the name of someone in a textbook. She said it the way you say the name of someone who is still in the room in a certain sense, even though he has been gone for decades. Weaver had farmed 30 miles east of the home place. He had grazed his wheat in the fall and winter of 1987, and had not pulled his cattle before jointing. And by May, his stand was dead, and the whole county had driven past that field and understood something that had calcified into local knowledge ever since, which was that you did not put cattle on wheat ground. Levi had been 24 years old. He had been farming this ground for 2 years. He had driven past the Weaver field enough times in that spring to carry the image of it for the next 32 years without losing any of its detail. Nora set a rinsed glass on the drying rack and kept her eyes on the window above the sink. She said, "You are not fighting your father's lack of knowledge. You are fighting a specific memory." Sadie stood with her hands still in the water and understood something that the folder could not address. The numbers were right. The data was right. Dr. Slater's 50 years of Oklahoma State research was right. None of that was the problem. The problem was a dead field in the spring of 1987, and a 24-year-old man who had stood at the road and looked at it long enough to learn something that no textbook had been able to unteach in the years since. Levi thought about it through July. He thought about it through August while he was prepping ground and ordering seed. In the first week of September, he came in from the shop and sat down at the kitchen table and said 2 words: the Hendricks place. The Hendricks place was 160 acres of leased ground on the west edge of the operation. Decent soil, but the most distant field, the one Levi considered the most marginal in the rotation. He said she could plant it the same as always, but if she wanted to try her grazing on it, she could try it there. He said she would manage it and track everything. He said if it went wrong, they would not do it again. Sadie said, "Yes, sir." She did not say anything else. She went out to the shop and pulled up the temporary electric fence supplier she had already been researching since June. Vernon Decker had been selling livestock feed and supplements in Pottawatomie County for 33 years. He ran Decker Farm and feed out of a metal building on the south edge of Westmoreland, and he knew every cattle producer in the county by name, by herd size, and by what they bought. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had been right about most things for most of his career. And there is a particular way that kind of record begins to function after enough years, which is that it starts to feel like evidence that you will continue to be right, which is not the same thing at all, but is easy to confuse. He had been at the co-op coffee counter the second Tuesday in September when the story of Levi Boone's daughter reached the table. Levi Boone's girl, he said, had come back from K-State with a plan to graze his wheat. 4 generations of Boones had built that place, planting wheat and cutting wheat, and she was going to put cattle on it. He shook his head in the way of a man delivering a verdict he has already reached. What he did not say at the co-op counter, because it was not a story he told in public, was that he had been there in 1987. He had sold supplement to Harold Weaver. He had seen the Weaver field in May of that year, driving past on the county road, the same route he had driven 100 times before, and he had slowed down and looked, and what he saw had lodged in his memory the same way it had lodged in Levi Boone's. He was not reacting to an abstract tradition when he said what he said at the co-op. He was reacting to a picture that had been in his head for 32 years. Sadie put her first fence posts in at the Hendricks place in the last week of September, dividing the 160 acres into 4 paddocks with temporary electric wire. She brought the stocker steers out in the first week of October, when the wheat had enough growth to support grazing without pulling plants from the ground. On the Tuesday of that same week, she was working along the east fence line checking the insulators when Vernon Decker's truck slowed on the county road and turned in at the gate. She heard the truck door. She kept working. He walked up to the fence line and stood looking at the cattle on the wheat, which at that growth stage was no more than 3 or 4 inches tall, and which under grazing pressure looked to anyone passing by exactly like what they feared it was. He said her name. She said his. She kept her hands on the fence wire. He said he had seen this before. She straightened up and looked at him. She said she knew he had. She said 1987, and Weaver, and she said the man had not pulled his cattle before jointing. She said she would pull hers. Vernon looked at her for a long time. He was 61 years old, and he had the look of a man who has watched enough ideas arrive with confidence and leave with regret. The confidence itself had begun to seem like a symptom rather than a sign. He said mildly, the way you say a thing you believe is simply true. Everyone thinks they will pull on time. He walked back to the truck. He drove out to the county road. Sadie stood at the fence with the tester in her hand, and the sentence still in the air around her. And she understood that she had not just been laughed at. She had been warned by a man who was not wrong about what he had seen in 1987, by a man who could not distinguish between what Harold Weaver had done and what she intended to do, because from the outside the difference between them was not yet visible. It would only become visible in the spring, and between now and spring there were 4 months of cold and dormancy, and a growing point she intended to check every week on her knees in the mud. That warning settled into her work the way cold settles into ground that has been saturated. It did not stop her. It made her careful in a way that was different from the carefulness she had brought home from K-State, which was the carefulness of a person who has read the right material. This was something older. This was the carefulness of a person who understands that someone is waiting to see her fail, and is not entirely wrong to wait. She was out at the Hendricks place twice a week through October, rotating the cattle through the paddocks on a schedule designed to keep the wheat from being grazed below 3 inches, the threshold below which recovery slows. She kept a spiral notebook on the seat of her truck and wrote in it after every check: date, field, growth height, cattle condition, any variation from the previous visit. In November, Levi drove out to the Hendricks place on a gray afternoon and stood at the fence for a long time, without saying anything. Sadie stood beside him. The field looked rough, grazed, trampled pale where the cattle had been heaviest. To anyone who had farmed wheat their whole life, it looked like damage because that was what it looked like before you knew what came next. He said, "Will it come back?" She said, "Yes, sir." Before jointing, he nodded once and drove back to the home place. That was all he said about it. 2 evenings later, Nora mentioned over the dinner dishes that Levi had called his cousin in Topeka. He had not asked any questions, she said. He had just told him what Sadie was doing on the Hendricks place. That was the kind of thing Levi Boone did when he was paying close attention to something he was not yet ready to say he believed in. Through December, the cattle worked the paddocks in rotation, and the days got short, and the temperature dropped into the 20s at night, and the wheat stood in whatever it could manage above the frost. Sadie was out there every week, not because the management schedule required it, but because she knew what the whole county was thinking, which was what Vernon Decker had said at the fence. Everyone thinks they will pull on time. She was not going to be Harold Weaver, not because the data said she would not be, but because she intended to earn the right to say she was not by doing the one thing that separated what she was doing from what he had done, which was to get down on her knees in a cold field every single week and check the growing point with her own hands. January came with a hard freeze, and the growing point still below the soil surface, and she moved the cattle to the dry lot at the home place. The field sat in the winter light, looking like it had taken a beating it would not recover from. Sadie looked at it and wrote the date in her notebook, and did not say anything to anyone because there was nothing to say until spring told the story. In March, the wheat at Hendricks came back. It came back the way the data said it would, which is to say that it tillered aggressively through April, and the color came in even across the paddocks. And by the first week of May, the stand was indistinguishable from a field that had never seen a single steer. Sadie walked it on a Thursday afternoon after the extension office closed and stood in the middle of the field and looked in every direction, and the wheat was shoulder height to her waist and green and full and entirely without the apology that the January field had seemed to require. She wrote in her notebook. She noted the tiller density in 3 paddocks and the color variation between the north and south ends and the height of the heads beginning to form. She did not write anything about being right. There was nothing to write about that yet. The yield would come in June, and the numbers would say what they said, and that would be what she had to work with. On a Friday morning that same week before Sadie was up, Levi drove out to the Hendricks place alone. She did not know he had gone until she came out to the barn at 7 and saw the tire tracks in the mud of the field road. The particular tread of his pickup pressed clean into the soft ground from a morning visit that had left no other evidence. He was at the shop when she walked in. He did not mention it. That evening he sat down at the kitchen table while she was going through her notebook, and he asked her what her stocking rate had been on the Hendricks place. Not, do you think it will yield? Not, was it worth it? The stocking rate. The specific technical question of how many head per acre she had been running through each rotation, which was the question of a man who was no longer asking whether the practice worked, but had moved on to asking how it worked and at what parameters. She told him. He wrote the number on the corner of the newspaper beside him and looked at it for a moment, and then got up and went to refill his coffee. He did not say anything else that night. He did not need to. The Hendricks place came in at 47 bushels per acre in June of 2020. The county average that year was 49. The yield penalty on the grazed field was 2 bushels per acre, which at the June wheat price worked out to $9.70 per acre in lost grain revenue. Sadie wrote that number down first because that was the number Vernon Decker and every other skeptic in Pottawatomie County would use if she let them choose the frame. Then she wrote down the other numbers. 40 stocker steers, 98 days on wheat pasture. Average daily gain across the group calculated from the final weigh before she moved them to the dry lot. In January was 2.18 pounds per day. She had sold them in April after 60 days in the dry lot on hay and a modest grain supplement. Average finished weight, 942 pounds. Price, $1.31 per pound. Total cost of production per head purchase. Price plus fence amortized over 10 years. Plus feed, plus minerals, plus veterinary came to $865. Gross revenue per head, $1,234. Net profit per steer, $369. 40 steers, $14,760 of net profit from the grazing enterprise alone, spread across 160 acres. That was $92 per acre of additional net revenue, minus the $9.70 yield penalty. Net gain over grain only $82.30 per acre. She set the notebook on the kitchen table and did not say anything while Levi read it. He read every line. He read it the way he read the yield records in the filing cabinet, which was carefully and without expression, the way a man processes information when he has trained himself not to reach conclusions before the page is finished. He read it a second time. He set the notebook down and looked at the wall for a moment. Not at anything in particular, just at the neutral middle distance, where a man goes when a number has arrived that requires some adjustment to the way things have been arranged. He said, "How many acres do you want next year?" She said, "All of them." He said, "Not all of them." He thought for a moment. He said, 400. She said, "Yes, sir." Nora refilled his coffee and looked across the table at Sadie and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying that her eyes had not already said. Joyce Gallagher had been the Pottawatomie County Extension Agent for 6 years by the fall of 2020, and she ran the fall extension meeting the way she ran most things, which was efficiently and without drama. She called Sadie in September and asked if she would present her first-year data to the group. Sadie said yes. She put together a 2-page summary of her numbers: cost of production, gain data, yield comparison, net revenue per acre. And she drove to the community center in Westmoreland on a Tuesday night in October, with 43 farmers in the folding chairs and Vernon Decker in the third row, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, in the particular way of a man who has already decided what he thinks before the speaker opens her mouth. She did not use a projector. She stood at the front of the room with a 2-page handout and walked through it the way she would walk a field methodically, starting at the perimeter and working toward the center. Yield comparison, gain per day, net revenue calculation, OSU 50-year data alongside her own first-year results. She showed them what she had and let the arithmetic make the argument. When she finished, she asked if there were questions. Vernon uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. He said that 1 year of data on 160 acres was not a system. He said it was a lucky guess. He said the spring weather had cooperated, and the calf prices in April had been decent, and she had had a narrow window and she had gotten through it. He said that was not a repeatable practice. That was a good year. He said it without particular hostility, the way a man says something he genuinely believes is obvious. Sadie looked at him. She said he was right that 1 year was not a system. She said that was exactly why she had included 50 years of Oklahoma State data alongside her own results. She paused for a moment. She said she would be very happy to present again next year, and the year after that. The room went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when no one is entirely sure who has just won something. Vernon leaned back and crossed his arms again and did not say anything else. Joyce thanked Sadie and moved to the next item on the agenda. 3 farmers came up to her after the meeting with questions. She gave each of them a copy of the OSU extension publication and her own 2-pager, and told them to call if they wanted to talk through the fencing setup. 2 of them called within the week. She drove home on the county road in the dark with the heater running and the notebook open on the passenger seat and wrote the date at the top of a new page. That was all she wrote. The date was enough. It was the beginning of the record she intended to build until the record was large enough that no one could call it a lucky guess with a straight face. The fall of 2020 was dry. Sadie had purchased 110 stocker steers in September and put them across 4 fields on the 400-acre expansion. The wheat came up in 2 of those fields thinner than she wanted, and by November it was clear that the subsoil moisture was not going to compensate for what the surface had not received in September and October. She walked those 2 fields on a Thursday afternoon in late November and made the calculation that the notebook in her truck did not make for her, which was that the wheat could not sustain the stocking rate she had planned through the full rotation. Without stress, she was not willing to impose on it. She pulled the cattle off those 2 fields 2 weeks ahead of schedule and accepted the lower grazing day total without calling anyone for a second opinion. She had been walking these fields since she was 12 years old, running the grain cart for Levi, and she knew how the east sections behaved in a dry fall because she had watched them enough years in a row to understand their particular way of showing strain before they showed damage. She did not need a formula to read what was already written in the color of the stand. The spring of 2021 came in with adequate moisture in March and April, and the wheat responded. The final yields across the 4 grazed fields averaged 44 bushels per acre, against a county average of 46. Yield penalty 4.3%. Her steers had averaged 2.09 pounds per day of gain over the grazing period, slightly below the first year, but within the expected range for a drier season. Net additional revenue spread across 400 acres, $74 per acre. 2 years. 2 data points. $82 per acre in year 1, $74 in year 2. The numbers were not identical because farming was not identical from one year to the next, but they were consistent in the way that mattered. They were both positive, both substantial, and both derived from the same principle applied to the same ground with the same careful attention to the one variable that could not be managed from a spreadsheet, which was knowing when to act. Before the calendar said you had to. Roy Keller had been at the October 2020 meeting. He farmed 80 acres of wheat ground on the north side of the county, and he had sat in the 3rd row 3 chairs from Vernon and listened to Sadie's presentation without asking any questions. He had taken a copy of the 2-pager on his way out. He had not called Sadie. He had not attended the field day Joyce organized in February. He had not asked about fencing setup or stocking rates or the specific timing of joining in his section of the county. He had read the 2-pager and decided he understood the practice well enough to try it, which is the decision that separates a man who learns from data from a man who learns from consequences. He put cattle on his wheat in October of 2020 and pulled them in late March of 2021. The growing point on his ground had jointed in the last week of February. By the time Roy Keller moved his cattle, the wheat had been grazed through its critical spring growth period for 3 weeks. The stand on 40 of his 80 acres did not recover. By May, it was the thing that Levi Boone had been carrying in his memory since 1987. A field that looked like everything people in Pottawatomie County had always known would happen if you put cattle on wheat. The Westmoreland County Fair ran the 3rd week of July. Sadie was there with Joyce, the 2 of them sharing a table in the community building, while Joyce staffed the extension display. They were drinking coffee from paper cups when she heard Roy Keller's voice from 2 tables over, loud enough to carry in the way voices carry in low-ceiling buildings when the speaker does not particularly care who hears. He said the Boone Girl system. He said he had tried it. He said he had lost 40 acres. He said she had not told anyone about that kind of risk. The people at the tables near him were quiet in the way people are quiet when they are listening to something that has the texture of a grievance being aired for an audience. Joyce put her coffee cup down and said quietly that Sadie needed to respond. Sadie stood up. She walked to Roy Keller's table without hurrying, and she stood at the corner of it and looked at him and said his name. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who had not quite calculated that she would be in the building. She asked what day he had pulled his cattle. He told her. Late March. She asked when jointing typically occurred on that section of the county. He did not answer. She said she had a copy of the timetable she had included on page 2 of the handout she gave him at the October meeting. She said she would send it again. She turned and walked back to Joyce's table and sat down and picked up her coffee. The tables around Roy were quiet for a moment longer, and then the conversation started again the way conversations do when the immediate situation has resolved and people are deciding what they think about what they just saw. Sadie did not look back across the room. She looked at Joyce, and Joyce looked at her, and neither of them said anything, because the moment had already said what needed saying. What Sadie did not know was that Vernon Decker was sitting at a corner table near the far wall. He had seen the whole thing. He had watched her walk across the room and stand at Roy Keller's table and ask 2 questions without raising her voice. And he had watched her walk back without performing anything in either direction. He sat with his coffee and thought about what he had seen for a while, and then he went back to the conversation he had been having before it, because that was what you did. But the thing he had seen did not leave the room with him. That night, Sadie came in from checking the late summer pasture to find Levi at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. He set the paper down when she came in. She understood from the way he set it down that he already knew about the county fair, which in Pottawatomie County meant someone had called him before she got home. She told him what had happened. He listened to the whole thing. Then he looked at the table for a moment and looked back at her and asked if she wanted to stop. It was not a question she had expected him to ask. He had never asked her anything like it before, and the fact that he asked it now told her something about how he understood the weight of what Roy Keller's 40 acres meant to the conversation she had been trying to have with the county for 2 years. She thought about the data. She thought about $82 per acre and $74 per acre, and the fact that both numbers came from the same principle correctly applied. Those were not the reasons she was going to say no, and she understood that while she was thinking them, which was a new piece of information about herself, she said no, she did not want to stop. He asked her why. She thought about it. The honest answer was not in the folder. It was not in the Oklahoma State data. It was not in any number she had written in any notebook. She said she could not do it. That was the only way she could describe it. She could not look at the practice she knew worked and the ground she had known her whole life, and the gap between what the operation was returning and what it could return, and choose to leave that gap alone. She did not know how to do that. Levi put his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at her and said she needed to keep going until the numbers said it loudly enough. He stopped for a moment. He said, or until you do not need the numbers anymore. He got up and took his coffee cup to the sink and rinsed it and went to bed. Sadie sat at the table for a while after he left the kitchen. That last part was not something her father typically said. He was a man of specific language of yields and costs and calendar dates, and the sentence he had just left in the room belonged to a different register than anything she had heard from him in 32 years of watching him farm. She did not know where it had come from. She thought it might have come from somewhere older than the filing cabinet in the mudroom. In the second week of August, she drove down to the Kansas State Library in Manhattan and spent an afternoon in the AG research section, working through the original Oklahoma State dual-purpose wheat trial documentation. Not the summaries, the raw data tables, the methodology sections, the appendices. She had read most of it before, but she was looking for something specific now, and she found it in the 14th volume in a table titled Known Management Failures with Notation, covering the period from 1987 through 1992. The 8th entry in the table read, Weaver H., Pottawatomie County, Kansas, 1987. Cattle not removed prior to jointing. Stand loss 60 to 70%. Followed by the researcher's notation in the adjacent column. Management failure, not system failure. Not anonymous. Harold Weaver, Pottawatomie County. His name in a federal research document 34 years after the fact, in a table that anyone with access to the library could read, with the footnote that the county had never attached to the story that had circulated among its farmers ever since. not the field dying, not the cattle ruining the wheat. The man making a specific error of timing that had nothing to do with whether the practice worked. She photographed the page with her phone. She drove back to Westmoreland in the early evening with the photograph on her phone and the sentence from her father somewhere in her chest, and she put the photograph in the back of her folder, where it would wait until someone needed to see it. The second extension meeting in October of 2021 drew 51 farmers. 8 of them had run some version of the dual-purpose system on their own ground that year. Sadie knew this because 3 of them had called her during the season with questions about stocking rates and jointing timing and fence setup, and she had answered every call and driven out to 2 of their farms to walk the fields with them. She had not charged anything for this. She did not think of it as generosity. She thought of it as the logical next step in building a record that was larger than one operation on one section of one county. Vernon Decker was not in the room. Roy Keller was. He sat in the last row near the door, and he did not ask any questions, and he did not make any comments, and he did not look at Sadie when she was presenting, and he did not look at her when she was done. He just sat in the last row near the door and listened to 2 years of data presented in a room of 51 farmers, 8 of whom had independent results that were beginning to fill in the shape of something that was larger than a single field or a single season. Sadie saw him once when she was scanning the room during the yield comparison section. She did not pause when she saw him. She kept moving through the data. After the meeting, most people left within 20 minutes. Joyce locked the front door and made 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the back office and brought them to the table where Sadie was organizing her materials. She sat down and looked at her coffee for a moment before she spoke. She said she was telling Sadie something that she probably should not be telling her in any official capacity. Vernon Decker had called the extension office 3 times in the past 12 months. Not to register a complaint, not to push back on anything Sadie had presented. He had called to ask questions. Gain rates by soil type, yield penalty data broken down by moisture quartile, cost per acre for temporary electric fencing over a 10-year amortization. The kind of questions a person asks when they are doing their own analysis and need information they do not yet have. Joyce said he did not know she was telling Sadie this. Sadie looked out the window of the back office. It was dark outside and the parking lot lights were on, and the first real cold of the season had come through that afternoon. The kind that arrives in October and does not leave. She thought about the man at the fence in October of 2019 with his 33 years of county knowledge and his memory of Harold Weaver's field in May. She thought about the way he had said what he said at the meeting in 2020. Not with hostility, but with the tone of a man stating something he believed was plainly true. She thought about the fact that this same man had been quietly, privately, methodically gathering the data he would need to reach his own conclusion. The people who watched most carefully were not always the ones standing at the front of the room. She drove home on the county road with the heater running and the notebook on the passenger seat. The soil moisture data she had been tracking since August was not good. The forecasts she had been reading for the past 6 weeks were not good. 520 acres under the dual-purpose system for the coming winter. 140 stocker steers in a weather pattern building to the west. That looked, if you read the maps, the way her father read yield records, like the kind of year that did not announce itself until you were already inside it. She pulled into the home place and sat in the truck for a moment before going inside. The yard light made a pale circle in the dark, and the house was lit in the kitchen window, and she could see Levi's silhouette moving past the glass, the way it had moved past that glass for 32 years. She opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date and the acreage and one line below it. Drought probability high. Trust the field, not the schedule. She put the notebook on the passenger seat where it had always ridden and went inside. She did not tell Levi what she had written. She set the notebook on the kitchen table next to his 30 years of yield records in their filing cabinet and looked at the two of them together in the low light of the kitchen for a moment before she turned off the lamp. Whatever was coming, it was going to arrive whether or not she had written it down. But she had learned something from the man who kept his records in that cabinet, which was that the act of writing a thing made it real in a way that thinking it did not, and that real things could be worked with in ways that unrecorded things could not. She went to bed. Outside, the first cold front of the season was already moving across the flat ground from the northwest. The kind of front that did not bring moisture, only cold pressing down on a water table that had already given most of what it had. The Tuesday morning of the second week of January 2022 came in at 18 degrees with a wind out of the northwest that moved across the flat ground without interruption for 30 miles before it reached the Hendricks place and kept going. Sadie parked on the field road and got out and walked into the east paddock with her hands in her jacket pockets and her breath going wide in front of her and the frozen stubble cracking under her boots. She had been watching the color of the wheat for 3 weeks. She knelt in the row and worked her fingers into the soil at the base of a plant and freed the crown from the frozen ground carefully, the way she had done every week since October, and held it up and looked at the growing point. It was still below the soil surface, technically within the safe zone. Technically, the cattle could stay another 2 weeks on the schedule she had written in November, the schedule that assumed adequate subsoil moisture and normal recovery rates, and a spring that would arrive the way springs were supposed to arrive. The color of the wheat was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not visibly wrong to anyone who had not been looking at these specific paddocks for 3 months, but wrong in the particular way that she had learned to read from years of walking fields beside a man who had never once told her what to look for, because he had always just started walking and expected her to look. The pale yellow-green at the leaf margins, the way the stand lay down in the wind instead of bending and springing back, the soil around the crowns going dry in ways that the surface moisture numbers did not capture because the surface was frozen, and the deeper readings told a different story. She stood up and looked across the paddock. The cattle were working the far end of the field 87 head on the east rotation, moving slowly through the frozen rows with the patient efficiency of animals that do not understand what they are doing to something that cannot yet defend itself. There was no table in the Oklahoma State data for this exact combination of variables. There was no entry in the research literature that said, when the leaf margin color reads this particular shade and the crown moisture presents this particular texture in the soil, and the subsoil forecast looks like what the subsoil forecast looks like, pull your cattle 14 days ahead of schedule and accept the lower grazing day total. Dr. Slater had never taught a class on this because it could not be taught in a class. It could only be learned by standing in a field in 18-degree wind and deciding whether to trust what your eyes were telling you over what your schedule was telling you. Sadie thought about what her father had said in the kitchen in August. She thought about the part that was not his usual language. She walked back to the truck and called the hand who was managing the east rotation and told him to move the cattle off the east paddocks and into the dry lot at the home place. Today. Not the end of the week. Today. She drove to the west fields and knelt in 3 more rows and read 3 more crowns and made the same call for 2 of those paddocks and held the 3rd one another 10 days before pulling it. She made every decision without calling anyone. She made them the way her father had made 32 years of decisions on the same ground, which was by knowing the ground well enough that the ground itself told you what it needed, if you were quiet and paying attention. Levi saw the cattle coming into the dry lot at 10 in the morning. He was at the shop when the truck came through the gate with the first load. He did not come out to ask. He did not call her. He watched from the shop door and then went back inside, and his silence on the subject for the rest of that week was the most complete statement of trust she had ever received from him. February came without meaningful moisture. March came the same way. The wheat moved into its spring growth period on reserves that had been diminishing since December. And what emerged from dormancy in the second week of March was thinner than any crop Sadie had grown under the dual-purpose system, and thinner than most of what the county was carrying. She walked her fields every week through April, and wrote in her notebook, and did not say much at dinner, because there was nothing useful to say that the June yield numbers would not say more precisely. Levi walked the fields with her twice in May. He did not comment on the stand. He walked the rows and looked at the heads, and looked at the color, and looked at the sky, which had the flat white quality of a sky that has been wrung out. And he came back to the truck each time, with the face of a man absorbing information he had been expecting, and did not enjoy receiving. On a Thursday afternoon in the second week of May, he came in from the fields and sat down at the kitchen table and said the crop was going to be short. Sadie was sitting across from him with her notebook open. She said she knew. The county yields came in the third week of June. Pottawatomie County averaged 31 bushels per acre, which was 37% below the 5-year average. The grain-only operations in the county were looking at somewhere between $20 and $40 of margin per acre after input costs, and the operations on higher-cost ground were looking at less than that or nothing at all. Sadie's dual-purpose ground came in at 29 bushels per acre, 2 bushels below the county average, 6.5% yield penalty, which was right at the long-term Oklahoma state average and slightly above her previous 2 seasons. The drought had taken yield from her the same way it had taken yield from everyone. She had not escaped the drought, but she had not entered the drought with only one way to win. Her 140 steers had grazed for an average of 84 days before she began pulling them off the stressed fields in January. Shorter than her previous seasons, but not nothing. Average daily gain across the group 1.94 pounds per day below her previous years, but positive throughout. She had sold them in April at an average of 918 pounds at $1.38 per pound. And the spring cattle market had been strong because the drought was regional and the feedlots were short and the buyers had been competing. Net profit per head $396. Total from the grazing enterprise across 520 acres, $55,440. Per acre, $107, combined with the wheat grain revenue of $209 per acre. The dual-purpose ground had returned $316 per acre in the worst drought year the county had seen in a decade. She put the notebook on the kitchen table and did not say anything while Levi read it. He read it the way he had read the first notebook, and the second carefully, and without expression, moving through each line, with the same method he brought to the yield records in the filing cabinet, which was the method of a man who does not announce his conclusions until he has finished reaching them. He set the notebook down. He looked at her. He said, "You were right." He said it the way a man says something that has cost him something to arrive at. Not because he was ashamed of having doubted, but because he understood the weight of what he was acknowledging, which was not just that the numbers worked, but that his daughter had stood at a fence line in October of 2019 and told a 61-year-old man with 33 years of county knowledge and a memory of Harold Weaver's field in 1987 that she would pull on time, and she had pulled on time, and she had pulled early. When pulling early was what the ground needed, even when the schedule said otherwise, and she had been right about all of it, including the part that the numbers could not capture. He said she would decide the rotation from here going forward. He picked up his coffee and went back out to the shop. Nora waited until his truck cleared the yard, and then looked at Sadie across the kitchen and said that Levi had called his brother Harold the previous week. He had told Harold that Sadie had figured out something he had not figured out. Nora said that was the highest compliment her father gave to anyone in the world. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said things that were true and did not require decoration. And then she went back to what she had been doing at the counter. Sadie stayed at the kitchen table for a long time after Nora left the room. Joyce changed the name of the October 2022 extension meeting to something she had never used before. Drought year results, what worked and what did not in Pottawatomie County. She sent the notice to the county newsletter and called the Farm Bureau and posted it on the extension office door. And 87 farmers showed up on a Tuesday night in Westmoreland, which was more than double the attendance of any previous meeting, and told its own story about what a bad year does to the appetite for answers. Sadie used a projector. Joyce had suggested it when she saw the registration numbers, and Sadie had put together slides for the first time, not because the data needed decoration, but because with 87 people in folding chairs, a 2-page handout was not going to reach the people in the back rows. She arrived 45 minutes early and set up the equipment and arranged her notes and looked at the room filling with farmers she had known her whole life, and farmers from the north end of the county she had never met, and a few faces from neighboring counties who had heard about the meeting from the Bureau. Vernon Decker was in the room. He was in the back row. He was not sitting with his arms crossed. Roy Keller was there too in the middle section, and he had driven himself, and he had not sat near the door the way he had in 2021. He was sitting in the middle of a row with people on both sides of him, which was a different posture than last year's back row position near the exit. The first slide was a 2-column table. Left column grain-only operations, drought year 2022. Right column dual-purpose operations, drought year 2022. The numbers in the 2 columns told the story before Sadie said a single word, and the room did what rooms do when a simple comparison lands harder than anything that follows it, which is go very quiet in the particular way of people doing arithmetic. She walked through 3 years of data. Year 1, good conditions, $82 per acre, above grain-only baseline. Year 2, dry fall adjusted management, $74 per acre. Year 3, historic drought adjusted management, including early removal in January, $107 per acre above grain-only baseline on an operation that had finished at 316 total. She explained why the margin was largest in the worst year. The cattle had generated revenue from the wheat's vegetative growth before the drought had a chance to eliminate the grain yield. The decision to pull cattle off the stressed fields ahead of schedule in January had protected what remained of the stand through its most vulnerable growth period. She had not avoided the drought. She had structured the operation so that the drought could not take everything in a single number. She asked if there were questions. Roy Keller raised his hand before Vernon Decker moved. The room registered this. People who had been at the county fair in July of 2021 remembered who Roy Keller was and what he had said about the Boone Girls system and 40 acres of dead wheat, and the fact that his hand was the first one up produced a specific quality of attention in the room that was different from the ordinary attention of people waiting for a question to be asked. He stood up. He said he was the person who had publicly blamed Sadie's practice for his losses at the county fair the previous summer. He said it without preamble, the way a man states a fact he has been carrying long enough that he no longer feels the need to soften its edges. The room was very still. He said he had been wrong. He said he had not read the material carefully and had not monitored his growing point and had not pulled his cattle before joining. And those were his failures and not failures of the system. He said he wanted to try it again this coming season and do it correctly. And he asked if Sadie could explain how to check the growing point in field conditions. Sadie looked at Roy for a moment. He was standing in the middle of a row with both hands at his sides and the expression of a man who has done something that cost him something in front of a room full of people. He would see every Tuesday at the co-op for the rest of his working life, and who had decided it was worth the cost. She said she was glad he had asked. She explained the physical check concisely, without restating what had already been covered in previous meetings for the people who had been there, and asked if he had the full technical documentation from the 2020 handout. He said he was not sure he had the complete version. She said she would send it that evening. She answered questions for 45 minutes after the meeting formally closed. Stalking rates on sandy ground. Fencing set up for irregular field shapes. Rotation scheduling when paddock sizes were unequal. Whether the practice worked with cow-calf pairs instead of stocker steers. She had driven out to 3 farms in previous years to walk fields and answer exactly these questions, and she answered them the same way here specifically, and without condescension, treating each question as the reasonable inquiry of a person trying to make a serious decision about their operation. The room cleared gradually. She was stacking her materials when she became aware that Vernon Decker had not left. He was standing at the far end of the table. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was looking at the floor in a way that was not evasive, but was the way of a man who is choosing how to begin something. He was 63 years old, and he had been the most influential voice in Pottawatomie County livestock feed for 33 years. And he had called a practice a lucky guess in front of 43 farmers in this same building 2 years ago. He said he had a customer. He said the man ran 200 head of stocker steers every winter and bought a significant volume of supplement from Decker Farm and Feed. And the customer had been asking Vernon about wheat grazing for the better part of a year, and Vernon had not had good answers for him. He stopped for a moment. He said he was wondering if Sadie would be willing to talk to the man. Sadie looked at Vernon. She let the silence stand for a moment without filling it. She said that in October of 2019 he had stood at the fence line of the Hendricks place and told her that everyone thought they would pull on time. He said he knew what he had said. She said that at the 2020 extension meeting he had told 43 farmers that her first-year results were a lucky guess. He said he knew that too. She set her notebook on the table and looked at him directly. She said she did not need him to admit anything to her. She said the thing she wanted him to understand was something different from that. She said the lesson of the past 3 years was not that wheat grazing was always the right answer for every operation. The lesson was that any farm running a single enterprise was one bad year away from a margin that did not cover its costs. The drought of 2022 had not created that vulnerability. It had simply revealed it. Every operation in this county that had been grain-only for the past decade had been carrying that risk through every good year without knowing it was there. Because good years do not reveal structural problems. Bad years do. She said she would be glad to talk to his customer. She said to have the man call the extension office and set up a meeting with Joyce, and she would be there. She picked up her materials and walked out. She heard Vernon's footsteps behind her a few seconds later, as he followed her out into the parking lot, where the October cold had settled since the meeting started, and they walked to their separate trucks without speaking. And she drove home on the county road with the heater running and the notebook on the passenger seat, and the particular clarity that comes after a long conversation that has finally said everything it needed to say. Darren Cole was 51 years old and had been running stocker steers through 2 adjacent counties for 20 years. Vernon sent him to the extension office in November, and Joyce set the meeting for a Thursday afternoon. He was not the kind of man who needed persuading. He had already read the OSU documentation and both years of Sadie's extension summaries before he sat down across from her, and his questions were the questions of someone converting information into operational decisions, rather than someone evaluating whether the information was credible. He asked about soil type variance because his ground was heavier than the Hendricks place, and he wanted to understand how that affected the timing thresholds. He asked about rotation scheduling across irregular paddock shapes. He asked one question that Sadie had not been asked before in quite this way. He asked what would have happened in January of 2022 if she had not pulled the cattle when she did. She told him she did not know. She said that was exactly why she had pulled them. He wrote that down. She watched him write it and understood that he was the kind of operator who treated the boundary of known information as a data point rather than an obstacle, which was the kind of understanding that separated people who learned from a single season of results from people who built something durable over time. He put cattle on wheat in October of 2022. He managed the rotation on his own through November and December, calling Joyce twice with questions, and once calling Sadie directly on a Saturday morning when he had walked a paddock and seen something in the stand color that he wanted to check his reading against. She talked him through it on the phone and confirmed that his reading was correct and that his planned management response was appropriate. On the 14th of December, he called the extension office and left a message. 2.2 pounds per day average across the group through the first 10 weeks of grazing. She got the message that afternoon and sat in her truck in the parking lot of the extension office for a moment before she drove home. She said to the windshield that she was glad to hear it. Then she started the truck. By the fall of 2023, 14 farms in Pottawatomie County were running some version of the dual-purpose system. Not all of them were doing it the way Sadie had done it on the Hendricks place. Some were grazing fewer acres. Some were using their own cow-calf pairs. Some were adapting the rotation schedule to their specific soil types and field configurations. The variation was not a problem. It was evidence that the practice had left the demonstration phase and entered the operational phase, which is the phase where a practice stops being one person's idea and starts being the county's vocabulary. Joyce wrote a county-specific extension bulletin based on Sadie's 3-year data set and the results from the other farms. It was downloaded 4,400 times in its first year, including requests from extension offices in 3 neighboring counties that had reached out to Joyce directly after the October 2022 meeting. The Kansas State Agronomy Department contacted Sadie about participating in a formal multi-county research trial. She said yes. Levi expanded the dual-purpose ground to 680 acres. The purchased hay budget dropped 30% because the cattle were arriving at the dry lot in better condition than they had in previous years, which meant they needed less supplement to maintain weight through the rest of the winter. Vernon Decker sent 3 customers to Sadie through the extension office. He did not make a formal statement about what had changed in his thinking. He stopped bringing up the subject at the Tuesday and Thursday morning co-op counter. And in a county where everyone had been listening to Vernon hold court on livestock management for 3 decades, the silence on that particular subject was heard the same way his previous pronouncements had been heard. It was its own kind of statement, and everyone at the counter understood it. In the spring of 2024, Sadie was invited to speak at the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers annual meeting in Salina. She drove up on a Thursday morning in Levi's pickup because her own truck was in for brake work, the seat smelling of the particular combination of diesel and old canvas that she associated with being 14 years old and learning to drive fence lines. She had not told anyone in the family she was going because it had not occurred to her to make an announcement about it, and she had not expected anyone to be there when she arrived. The room held 340 farmers from across the state. She set up her materials and checked the projector connection and reviewed her notes while the chairs filled. And when the program coordinator introduced her, and she walked to the front of the room, she scanned the audience the way she always did in the first few seconds out of habit, orienting herself to the room. She saw Levi in the 4th row. He was sitting with his seed cap in both hands, turning it by the brim, the way he turned things when he was thinking. And he was looking at the front of the room with the expression he wore when he was paying serious attention to something. Levi Boone did not attend events like this. He had not attended the county extension meetings. He had not attended the Farm Bureau presentations. He was a man who expressed his opinions about the state of Kansas agriculture through the records he kept in a filing cabinet and the decisions he made before sunrise, not through the act of sitting in a folding chair in a convention center in Salina. Sadie lost her place for a half second. She found it again and continued. She was 3/4 of the way through her presentation when she allowed herself to look at him again. He was still in the 4th row. He had stopped turning the cap. He was holding it in both hands and looking at the screen where the drought year comparison was projected. The same 2-column table she had first shown in Westmoreland in October of 2022. And she could see from his posture that he was not looking at the numbers on the screen, because he did not need to. He had those numbers in his head, the same way he had 30 years of yield records in his head. He was looking at the room, looking at the numbers, and she understood that he had come here not to hear her presentation, but to see what 3 years of data looked like in a room of 340 strangers. She finished. The applause began the way applause begins in a room full of farmers, which is to say it began honestly and without performance, because farmers do not applaud things they have not decided to applaud. Levi Boone stood up. He was one person rising in the middle of a seated room, and the people immediately around him glanced at him with the brief, curious attention of people who do not know why someone is standing. And then they looked back at the front of the room. He stood straight with his cap in both hands, and he did not look around to see who was noticing. He stood for the duration of the applause, and then he sat back down and put his cap on and looked at the floor between his boots with the expression of a man who has just done something that has embarrassed him slightly and whom embarrassment will not stop from doing again. Sadie looked at him from the front of the room. She thought about a Thursday evening in November of 2019 when she had been standing at the sink and her mother had stood beside her with a dish towel and said Harold Weaver's name in the tone of someone naming something that was still present in the room. She thought about the fence line at the Hendricks place in January with 18-degree wind pressing across the flat ground from the northwest, and a growing point that had not yet jointed, and a stand color that told a story the schedule had not accounted for. She thought about the manila folder on the kitchen table and the particular way her father had looked at it, and the way he had looked at the same table 8 months later, when the notebook showed him what the Hendricks place had returned, and the way he had said you were right, with the weight of a man putting down something he had been carrying since before she came home. She gathered her materials. The program coordinator thanked her and moved to the next item. People came forward with questions, the same questions in larger numbers, and she answered them one at a time the way she had always answered them specifically, and without hurry until the room had mostly cleared, and the convention center staff were beginning to arrange the chairs for the next session. On the drive back, she did not turn on the radio. The flat ground ran out on both sides of the highway in the late afternoon light. The wheat country she had grown up inside, and she drove through it. The way she drove it every season, paying attention to the color of the fields, and the way the wind moved through the standing grain, and the quality of the light that told you something about the moisture content of the air above the ground, even when you had not checked the forecast. Levi's truck was in the yard when she got home. He had taken a different route back and arrived before her. She saw the light in the shop. She went inside and put water on for coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the 2 notebooks side by side, her own from the 2019 season in its spiral cover, and Levi's 30-year yield records in the filing cabinet beside the mudroom door. She had started a 3rd notebook in January of 2024 for the Kansas State Research Trial data, and it was on the table too. 3 notebooks representing a span of 55 years of attention, paid to the same ground by 2 people with the same last name, approaching the same questions from opposite directions. The shop light went out. She heard Levi's boots on the porch steps. Owen came home in the 3rd week of September. He was 20 years old, and he had spent 2 years working cattle on a ranch in the Flint Hills, which is the kind of place that does things to a person's understanding of grass and soil and the relationship between grazing pressure and land health that classrooms discuss but cannot replicate. He had been reading during those 2 years the kind of reading that happens when a person has time to observe something closely and then reads to understand what they are observing. And he had developed a specific interest in a grazing methodology that had not come up in any of the conversations around the Boone kitchen table. He helped with the wheat planting through September, and then on an evening in the first week of October, he sat down at the kitchen table and put a folder in the center of it. He said he had been looking at mob grazing, ultra-high-density, short-duration grazing using temporary electric fence to move cattle through paddocks as small as a quarter acre, with long rest periods between grazings. The research showed significant improvements in soil organic matter water infiltration rates and perennial grass productivity over time on native pasture ground. He said he thought it might complement what Sadie was doing on the wheat acres applied to the Boone native pasture through the summer months when those acres were currently being managed the same way they had always been managed. He looked at Sadie. He looked at Levi. Levi looked at the folder. He looked at Sadie. She looked at the folder on the kitchen table between her and her younger brother, and she thought about the spring of 2019. A different folder on this same table, and her father's face in the particular arrangement it had taken, when he looked at something new that contradicted the weight of what he already knew. She thought about the fence line at the Hendricks place in October of 2019 with Vernon Decker standing at the road saying everyone thinks they will pull on time. She thought about the January morning with the 18-degree wind and the growing point that had not jointed, and the decision she had made without a formula, and the silence from the shop door when her father saw the cattle moving and said nothing, because silence was the way he said the thing that mattered most. She thought about what it had cost to be right before anyone believed she was right, and what it would have cost the operation if she had not been willing to carry that cost, and what it would have cost Pottawatomie County if the Hendricks place had not come in at 47 bushels in June of 2020, with $82 of additional margin per acre beside it. She pulled the folder across the table toward herself and opened it. She said, "Show me the data." Owen pushed the folder the rest of the way. Levi picked up his coffee and looked at the window above the sink, where the last of the October light was going gray behind the fields. The kitchen went on being a kitchen in the way it had always been a kitchen, which is to say a place where the important decisions of the operation arrived before they arrived anywhere else, carried by the people who had to make them. The spiral notebook from 2019 was on the shelf in the mudroom beside the filing cabinet. Sadie's hand on every page, every yield measurement and stocking rate and growing point observation from the Hendricks place forward, sitting in the same physical space as 30 years of her father's records. She had started a new notebook for the mob grazing trial that fall the first page, containing Owen's calculations on the native pasture ground and the questions she was trying to answer about rest periods and paddock sizing and soil recovery rates on heavy ground. She kept the notebook on the seat of her truck the way she always had. Darren Cole's stocker steers had grazed wheat for the first time in the fall and winter of 2022 and came in at 2.2 pounds per day. He had called in December to tell her. She had said she was glad to hear it, and had meant it in the way you mean something when the evidence you have been building for years arrives in the voice of a man you have never met, who simply followed the method and got the result. The method was designed to produce. The county extension bulletin had been downloaded 4,400 times. 3 neighboring counties were in their second year of independent trials. The Kansas State Research Project had moved past its preliminary phase. 14 farms in Pottawatomie County were running the dual-purpose system in configurations that had adapted the original practice to specific soil types and herd structures and field geometries, which meant the practice had become the county's own rather than a single family's experiment. She had planted wheat in wheat country. The people who knew the county had their reasons for doubt. The drought had come, and the grain-only fields had returned margins between nothing and $40. And the dual-purpose fields had returned $316 per acre. And the numbers had said what they always said, when they were large enough and patient enough and built on ground that had been watched carefully for long enough. The notebook had said, try something different. The ground had not argued, and the operation that had been built across 4 generations to hold on had discovered in the course of 3 years and 1 historic drought that holding on had never been the limit of what it was built to do.